Good afternoon to all of you here and to all of you on the internet. I'm Stefanos Polizoidis, Dean of the School of Architecture. This lecture tonight is sponsored by the Department of Art History and Design. So it's one of our, I think it's the second lecture we had in common this semester, a very welcome development. The lecturer is Professor Richard Etlin. It gives me great pleasure to introduce him for very complex reasons. I know that we're together at Princeton together as graduate students in architecture. He stayed on as a lifer at Princeton. He stayed on to get a second master's degree and a PhD from Princeton. But it turns out after a couple of glasses of wine last night that we figured out that we're also together as undergraduates in Princeton. So this is the first time I've been with him in more than 50 years, I think in 54 years, which is quite an extraordinary accomplishment, considering that I've read most of his books and known about his adventures in academia for all these decades, as many of you are as well. Richard, if I can call him that because he was my classmate, I can take liberties here, is one of the great academics of his generation. His background and his contributions in this field of art history is most extraordinary. He studied at Kentucky and for 4 or 5 years, I think it was, and maybe for most of his career at the University of Maryland. And he is the author of a countless number of articles, an extraordinary number of lectures, all kinds of initiatives all over the world. One of those people whose reputation and whose performance in his academic duties is without peer in our generation. So we're very happy to have him. He's going to be talking about a real fond issue for us, the design and current state of the Pantheon and its meaning. He's been working on this one for 20 years. 20 years, that's quite an accomplishment. I found out from sitting with the students this afternoon for lunch that he only engages in topics that he falls in love with, meaning buildings, of course. Let's leave it at that. And before I invite him to the podium, I would like to read out his books because there are so many of them, and although I could remember some of them, I couldn't remember all of them. So let me just make sure I read those for you so that you are aware and you can seek them in your work as you're going forward in your own studies and your own projects. The Architecture of Death, the Transformation of the Cemetery in 18th Century Paris, that's 1984, MIT. Modernism in Italian Architecture, 1890 to 1940. That is an MIT 1991 book. Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, Manchester University Press, 94. Symbolic Space, French Enlightenment Architecture and its Legacy, Chicago, 1994. And In Defense of Humanism, Value in the Arts and Letters, Cambridge, 1996. It is an enormous pleasure to have you here. It's wonderful to have been with you for a few hours yesterday and a few today. Hoping to have you here many more times in the future. Let's welcome Richard Etlin to the podium.
Well, thank you, Stefanos, doubly, both for the invitation and for the overly generous introduction. And I thank all of you in the audience who've come out tonight to hear what I'm going to be talking about the Pantheon. Over the course of the next hour, I wish to demonstrate the degree to which the Pantheon can be considered as a solar building. Thanks to the sectional views published by Robert Hanna and Julie O'Malley in 2011, we know that a partial shaft of sunlight passes through the grill over the Pantheon's door to land on the porch at noon at the time of the equinoxes. The full shaft fills the entrance bay, which occupies the thickness of the rotunda just behind the door at noon on April 21st, Rome's birthday. and that the full shaft lands inside the rotunda, somewhat behind the door at noon on the summer solstice. But before exploring this theme further, I must first establish the relevant background. And please give me 10 minutes before proceeding to the next solar photos. Italy's preeminent 19th century archaeologist, Rodolfo Lanciani, famously called the Pantheon the Sphinx of the Campus Martius. Although the best preserved Roman monument, it refuses to yield so many of its secrets, including who was the patron of the current building, and what was the form of Agrippa's previous Pantheon building on the same site. Most scholars now believe that Trajan had the Pantheon designed and constructed up to some unknown level of the drum before his death. Yet even in this scenario, it was left to Hadrian to construct the roofing. Would it be a cone or a dome? And to design all the marble decor for the interior, as well as to design and build the porch. Hence, I'm going to refer to this building as Hadrian's Pantheon. With regard to Agrippa's Pantheon, in 1892, Lanciani was convinced that according to the new archaeological studies of the site, Agrippa's Pantheon was a tholos with the same diameter as Hadrian's and also with an oculus, and with a porch that extended outward as far as Hadrian's subsequent porch. The preeminent German archaeologist of the time agreed with Lanciani, albeit debating whether the top lining came from an oculus or from a central clerestory, as at the mausoleum known today as Santa Costanza. Several years later, Lanciani, mistakenly, I believe, would change his mind and decide that Agrippa's Pantheon had not been a north-facing building with a footprint much like Hadrian's, but rather a south-facing rectangular hall preceded by a vast circular courtyard. For the purposes of this lecture, I will adhere to Lanciani's first instinct, seconded by the Germans. A more complete demonstration of all these claims will have to await another occasion. The civic function of the Pantheon was not insignificant. Hadrian is said to have held court in his Pantheon, and Darrell Phillips is probably correct in arguing that Agrippa's earlier building on the site served as a meeting house for the Senate when it was obliged to assemble outside the city limit known as the Pomerium. Yet, one might say that the Pantheon's primary purpose was to serve as a symbolic building. In 1871, Friedrich Adler remarked that the vast expanse of the Pantheon's interior provided an architecture appropriate for an empire with world dominion, thereby signaling that Rome was a Weltstadt, that is, a world city. We can go even further by noting that Rome's major epic poets, Naevius in the 3rd century BCE, Aeneas, writing in the early 2nd century BCE, and Virgil, writing during the age of Augustus, had sung the song of Rome's prophetic destiny to rule over the world. For Aeneas, as William Longseller has taught us, this prophetic destiny was grounded in the divine birth of Romulus and Remus, fathered by Mars, in Romulus's ritual founding of the city according to the Etruscan rite, the Augustum Augurium, and in the deification of Romulus, Rome's first king, who ascended to the sky at the time of his death. Virgil conjoined Rome's alternative foundation story, whereby Jupiter assured Venus that her son Aeneas would be the progenitor of the race that would found the city of Rome, with Augustus, the adoptive son of the divinized Julius Caesar, a descendant of the Aenean line, as destined to fulfill Rome's destiny. As Jupiter in the first book of Virgil's Aeneid famously proclaimed of Rome, "For these I set no bounds in space or time, but have given empire without end." With its unprecedented dome, spanning approximately 142.5 feet, such that a circle or sphere could be inscribed within the interior, the Pantheon had the cosmic scale to embody this vision. It was located on the Campus Martius at the Palace Caprae, the Goat Marsh, which Livy recorded as the place of Romulus's deification, and as Filippo Corelia suggested, by implication, when Augustus died, he too would enjoy this honor. Finally, the statues of Mars and Venus inside the rotunda, along with that of the divinized Julius Caesar, gave eloquent testimony to how the Pantheon embodied Rome's two foundation stories, combining the epic heritage of Aeneas and Virgil. The designer of the Pantheon, though, went even further. By coordinating the noontime visit of the sun god, as represented by the dramatic shaft of sunlight, with the most consequential times of the year. These included the two equinoxes, when day and night were equal, and the summer solstice, when the sun was highest in the sky and the day was longest. As we will see, significant places in the Pantheon were provided with special arrangements of colored stones that conveyed a straightforward message about Rome's prophetic destiny. In addition, the solar shaft appeared to mark and celebrate Rome's foundation day, its birthday on April 21st, by seeming to select at noon the entrance bay to the rotunda, site of the Pantheon's threshold stone, which it fully illuminated. As Arnold von Gennep famously pointed out in his book of 1909, Rites of Passage, a systematic study of the rites of the door and the threshold and the doorway of a building enjoyed a symbolic function all over the world, affecting passage from one ontological realm to another. And in Rome, the consecration ceremony for a temple involved consecration rites at the doorway by the threshold. Various scholars, Robert Hanna with Giulio Magli, Eugenio La Rocca, and Marina de Franceschini with Giuseppe Veneziano, have suggested that on the significant days noted above, the equinoxes, the summer solstice, and Rome's birthday, the emperor might have walked into the shaft of light at noon to effectuate an epiphany. Although such a ritualized gesture is not known to have been part of Roman practice, the literary scholar Philip Hardy, citing a related Egyptian pharaonic custom, has suggested that perhaps Virgil was hinting at something comparable when in the Aeneid he portrayed Augustus as sitting in front of his Palatine temple of Apollo, quote, seated at the snowy threshold of shining Phoebus. Various tales of Augustus's childhood, recounted by Suetonius, the historian writing during the time of Hadrian, set the stage for this type of ritual encounter with the sun god. One recounted that the mother of Octavian, that is, the future Augustus, had fallen asleep in a temple of Apollo, whereby the god in the form of a snake impregnated her. The god left an indelible colored mark on her skin that portrayed the snake. After the birth of Octavian, he was, quote, therefore regarded as the son of Apollo. As a precedent or justification for a solar encounter at the Pantheon, a further tale related that as an infant, Octavian disappeared from his ground floor crib and was found sitting at the top of a tall tower with his face bathed by the sun. This last tale receives a parallel in another legend of a solar epiphany regarding Octavian's arrival in Rome in the spring of 44 BCE to accept the terms of Julius Caesar's will, taking his name and his inheritance, and most importantly, becoming his adoptive son. In the words of the historian Velius Paterculus, and I quote, when Octavian arrived, a large crowd of his friends met him, and when he entered the city, there was seen above his head the orb of the sun in a perfect circle, and around his head a multicolored arc, as though a crown was placed on the head of a man soon to be great. Scholars have debated both sides of the argument as to whether this is a legend or a record of an actual halo and rainbow. No matter, for the story is the point. These tales help to establish the likelihood that Augustus ceremoniously stepped into the shaft of sunlight that arguably penetrated the oculus of Agrippa's Pantheon, thereby initiating a custom continued in Hadrian's replacement building. Now, keeping in mind, then, the likelihood of solar encounters at the Pantheon, let us now consider the areas illuminated on the floor, walls, and doorway on these and other significant days. At noon on the equinoxes, the solar disk, as Claudia Del Monte and Nicoletta Lanciano observed, centers on the cornice that separates the drum from the dome. This is the halfway point that divides the interior into two equal parts. We might add that this means that the solar disk is bisected by the cornice, with one half resting on the dome and the other half on the wall of the rotunda. This is a perfect visual metaphor for the equality of day and night on the equinox, rendered visible through a superimposition of the sun on the architecture at its midpoint, thereby uniting the two in conveying a narrative of solar and architectural unison. As we can see in this photo, most of the sun does not pass through the grille over the entrance door, and the perforated surface of the grille further reduces the light that will fall on the emperor's face as he stands on the porch at noon on those days. At Agrippa's Pantheon, this epiphany would also have the sun celebrate Augustus's birthday. Although the birth date seems to have occurred not precisely on the day of the fall equinox, its proximity would have made the association possible. As Lothar Hasselberger has noted, this near coincidence in time was relevant enough for the province of Asia in around 9 BCE to start the year with Augustus's birthday, since it nearly coincided with the autumnal equinox. The symbolism of Augustus's encounter with the sun on the Pantheon's porch at noon on the equinox in this reduced light would have been appropriate because, as a living emperor, he had not yet been deified, and hence did not yet merit a solar encounter with the full shaft of light, which occurs only inside the Pantheon. As the Roman historian Cassius Dio explained, the statues of Agrippa and Augustus were placed only on the porch and not inside the temple. Now, if you open virtually any book or article on the Pantheon, you will find a floor pattern for the central aisle of the porch, showing 4 Egyptian gray granite discs alternating with 3 rectangular bars of the same stone. In 1997, Kim Williams published a plan of the Pantheon that presents the most accurate color arrangement of the floor of the entire building, while also showing that the central aisle of the porch is missing the central gray rectangular bar. All subsequent published studies of the Pantheon, except one, have ignored this revised floor plan, and none have commented on its significance. Just as the sun alights on the upper cornice inside the rotunda, which bisects the building, as well as this luminous disk, into 2 equal parts, symbolic of the midpoints of the solar year, so too does the sun at noon land at this time in a significant location on the porch. In fact, it forms a luminous bar that occupies the empty space that bisects the sequence of granite discs and bars along the central approach axis. Hence, the sun god completes the pattern with a transient bar of light with a symbolic visualization of the equinox. The visual effect is startling, and once you have seen it, then every time that you return to the Pantheon outside the season of the equinoxes, then you will think of this central empty space as the sun's preferred location, where it will always alight at the time of the equinoxes. Once again, solar performance and architecture are harmonized together within a meaningful and unanticipated design. Today, the Pantheon's porch is faced with a front row of gray Egyptian granite columns, albeit marred at the left corner by a mismatched 17th century replacement. All the columns behind them are rose Egyptian granite. 2 scholars, Kiel de Licht and Amanda Claridge, believe that originally all the columns around the perimeter were gray granite, leaving only the 4 central columns as rose granite. Well, either configuration lends itself to narrative meaning. For Claridge, it was like, quote, a satin lining in an otherwise sober suit. Yet, we can also postulate a solar meaning. The rose granite of these columns was the same stone used in Egyptian obelisks. Augustus famously brought 2 obelisks from Heliopolis, the city of the sun, to Rome, where they were erected and dedicated in either 10 or 9 BCE. The obelisk at the meridian near the altar of Augustan peace, as Lothar Hasselberger emphasizes, was appreciated as an Egyptian monument symbolic of the sun god's rays. Hence, these rose granite columns at the Pantheon embrace and mark the space of the solar presence, even in its absence, much like the missing gray granite bar on the floor of the porch. In the late 16th century, an engraving by Etienne Dupeyrac and a drawing by Piero Ligorio show the porch of Hadrian's Pantheon partially surrounded by marble panels with female personifications of Rome's provinces. In the 19th century, when the panels were no longer present, the French Prix de Rome architect Achille Leclerc, followed by his student Charles-Édouard Isabelle, each restored the Pantheon with these symbolic panels. By measuring these panels, Isabelle was able to ascertain that they fit precisely as pairs between the outside columns of the Pantheon's porch. A model of the Pantheon displayed at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art's late 19th century Hall of Casts followed suit. Recent historians, wrongly I believe, date these panels only to Antoninus Pius's later Temple that divinized Hadrian, in whose vicinity many of the panels were found, albeit with none in place in the temple. These scholars argue that illustrations such as Duperrac's and Ligorio's simply mean that these more than 11,500-pound panels were dragged about 200 meters across the campus marshes during the Middle Ages merely to furnish several perimeter wall sections to the Pantheon's porch while it was a papal church. Yet, if we accept the historical evidence at face value, as well as the 19th century restorations, then we have here on the porch the first instance at the Pantheon of the emperor standing with the embrace of the sun god at the center of a symbolic representation of the entire empire. On April 21st at noon, the message becomes more explicit. Whereas the stones of the porch were monochrome gray, set against a neutral white marble floor, on April 21st, the illuminated entrance bay features the emperor, standing upon a red porphyry disc, which was the imperial stone, surrounded by a yellow marble square, symbolic of the sun god. At the Pantheon, the appearance of the sun god through his shaft of light at noon on April 21st, Rome's birthday, is highly dramatic. Whereas it is true that the sunlight fills the entrance bay for a period of 2 weeks, resting in that space for a considerable amount of time after the moment of noon, there is an additional type of encounter that takes place at noon on that day, comparable to the so-called kiss of the sun at the Serapeum of Alexandria, as described by Rufinus of Aquileia, who spent 8 years in Alexandria toward 373 to 380 CE, and I quote, "There were also certain devices designed by cunning and artistry for the astonishment and admiration of onlookers. A very small window had been so positioned with respect to the sunrise that on the day on which it had been decreed that an image of the sun was to be carried inside to greet the statue of Serapis, the timing had to be observed carefully as the image entered, so that a sunbeam passing straight through that very window would light up the mouth and lips of Serapis to give the effect, as people watched, that Serapis was apparently receiving a kiss from the sun in salutation." Although this account was written in the 4th century CE, it is likely that this practice dated back to earlier times preceding the construction of Agrippa's and Hadrian's respective Pantheon buildings. Viewing the doorway from inside the Pantheon, as the time approaches noon on April 21st, the sun descends along the wall as it moves toward the door at a measured pace. The movement imparts a sensation of active presence of divinity inside the building. Here is a sequence of photos that shows a slow but steady progression as the sun proceeds toward the entrance portal with a downward and lateral sweep, followed by what appears to be upward movement as if expressing intentionality to reach up to embrace the entrance portal all the way up to the top of the vault. The light reflected off the far wall of the entrance bay, as well as off its floor, illuminates the entire volume, thereby giving the illusion that the sun has risen upward to embrace the vault. In the Renaissance, Serlio would stress the importance of reflected light in the 6 chapels of the Pantheon built into the thickness of the rotunda's wall. Yet, in no other place and at no other time would such reflected light play so important a role for the Pantheon's narrative as in the entrance bay at noon on April 21st. It has taken 47 minutes for the sun to move through this sequence, and we still are 2 minutes away from noon. As the sun outside reaches its highest position at what might be called perceptual noon, the shaft of sunlight inside embraces the entranceway of the rotunda, leaving the imprint of a slight arc of light to either side of the portal, as if splitting a circle into two separate parts. Attentive observers would recognize that this kiss at the entrance portal was not only a reconsecration of the threshold, but also an evocation of Cleopatra's giant pearl split in two to serve as earrings for the colossal statue of Venus inside the Pantheon, a celebration of Octavian's victory at Actium. The Battle of Actium, for both the age of Augustus and for modern historians, was, in the words of Ronald Syme, quote, the birth legend in the mythology of the Principe and the foundation myth of the New Order. It is now being celebrated by the sun god at the Pantheon. Hence, every year at noon, on Rome's birthday, in the building that celebrates Rome's foundation, the sun also celebrates the foundation of this new political order. Educated Romans would recall that in Propertius's poem on Actium, as S.J. Harrison has explained, the poet had asserted that Romulus's foundation on the hallowed site is worth nothing unless Augustus wins the battle. And Hadrian's giant epigraphy across the facade proclaiming that Agrippa made this links the two Pantheon buildings together, while also recalling Agrippa's role as Octavian's successful admiral in that battle. The ephemeral image of light that evokes the Cleopatra split pearl at the Pantheon's entrance portal reinforces the permanent message of the Basilica of Neptune attached to the rear of the Pantheon, which can be understood as celebrating Agrippa the Admiral and the Battle of Actium. This solar performance, as if the sun were kissing the portal, passes away within 2 minutes in a seeming acceleration of flight. The light phenomenon is well known to the locals. One time, I overheard a middle-aged Roman matron say to another, as the two arcs of light moved off the portal, "È passato." It has passed. It's over. Her tone gave me the impression that she and her friend considered this to be a magical event that they came to observe year after year. They knew what to expect, but even then, the event was still thrilling. I have no reason to believe that the ancient Romans would not have felt the same. In effect, the seeming acceleration of this moving shaft of light over the wall surface as it passes on to embrace the void of the portal, remaining in place for this brief arc of time, is breathtaking. In short, there is something uncanny about how the sun at noon, on the equinoxes, has its disk bisect the building at the line of the upper cornice, as it falls onto the open space between the gray granite markers, and how on April 21st, Rome's birthday, it fills the entrance bay to the rotunda while splitting to kiss the interface of the entrance portal. It is as if the sun were selecting these specific places. Yet at noon on the summer solstice, the sun's choice of location is truly eerie, because it does not fall on the first square behind the rotunda's entrance, but rather onto the second square, which is also the first square with a red porphyry disk situated behind the entrance bay. It is as if the sun is seeking out and selecting this particular spot within the vast field of squares and circles. Hence, the type of encounter of the emperor with the sun that occurred inside the entrance bay on April 21st is repeated here, as the emperor stands within the shaft of sunlight such that the sun embraces him. The imperial symbolism of the red porphyry discs on the Pantheon's floor, as well as that of the purple porphyry plasters of the attic zone, may well have been given explicit meaning by the presence of a porphyry statue of Hadrian. And although there is no evidence of such a statue inside the Pantheon, His presence was certainly possible, given the existence of a porphyry statue of Hadrian at Caesarea Maritima. As Dio explained, the Pantheon's dome evoked the heavens. The heavens had deep resonance for Ennius, for whom the cosmos was, quote, a celestial temple. That's fragment 48. To Aeneas, the celestial temple was neither a neutral nor an indifferent cosmological entity. As modern scholars have stressed, the extant fragments of his epic poem, The Annals, seem to convey, in the words of Jackie Elliott, quote, a chronological continuity between the origins of the universe and Roman history, such that the heavenly bodies presided over action unambiguously centered in Rome, which was the hub of space and time, the primary focus of the cosmos in all of its aspects. This vision, stresses Eliot, was new and had widespread resonance. Hadrian's Pantheon gave symbolic form to this idea, not only by presenting the cosmos as a celestial temple, but also through numerical symbolism. As William Lorkie pointed out, the 5 rows of coffers in the dome can be understood both as symbolizing the 5 circles of the universe as depicted on an Ormalevi sphere, and also as what Plutarch and others considered the 5 zones of the earth. And as Diane Favreau has stressed, Rome's symbolic topography of the divinely sanctioned 7 hills, which, according to the antiquarian Varro, furnished the ancient name for Rome as Septimontium, may be related to a symbolic representation of the theme in the rows of 28 coffers and in the 28 vertical ribs of the dome. Toward the year 8 BCE, Augustus had multiplied the number 7 for the hills of Rome by 2 to organize the city into 14 administrative zones, which vaguely corresponded to 7 hills and 7 valleys. And by doubling that number into 28, Hadrian had effectively created an image of expansion, such that the city of Rome symbolically coincided with the cosmos. Just as the solar embrace, in the form of an epiphany in the encounter between the emperor and sun god, is intensified at noon on the solar solstice, so too is the political narrative of the solar encounter amplified to reinforce this numerological symbolism. The solar disk on the ground shown here also alights upon parts of 4 hollow red squares, each appearing as a 3-sided open form extending off into space according to the 4 cardinal points of the compass, as if they were vectors reaching out into the entire world so as to embrace it and to include it within their domain. This, then, is a visual metaphor of Rome's rule over the oikumene, with the imperial red porphyry lines extending outward from the red porphyry disk, symbolic of the emperor and his guiding hand, consecrated by the enveloping yellow square of the sun. This political message, as we have seen, was first conveyed on the porch through a combination of the encompassing perimeter of allegorical panels of the provinces, coupled with the emperor's stance within the divine light of the sun at noon on the equinoxes, and seconded by the frame of rose granite columns. Now, this message has been repeated inside the rotunda, totally abstractly, through a combination of light, form, and color, also with the emperor within the embrace of the sun, both literally within the solar shaft and symbolically at the center of a red porphyry disk surrounded by a yellow solar square. The visible, gentle, convex curvature of this floor, repeatedly associated by scholars as evocative of the Earth's surface, reinforces this message. This meaning is enhanced when one considers that the floor of the rotunda presents a uniform background field of veined Phrygian marble called pavonazzetto, white in color with purple striations. The choice of stone is not indifferent. Rather, it has important political symbolism. Along with green-veined Christian marble, pavonazzetto was the other marble that Fabio Bari identifies as a Roman symbol of water. In fact, pavonazzetto was used for the giant drain cover representing the god Oceanus, the so-called Bocca della Verità, that Barry believes was located at one of Hadrian's shrines, Hercules' shrines at the Forum Boarium. As Rabin Taylor has suggested, the Vanozzetto may have been selected for the Bocca della Verità because its coloring recalls Homer's reference to the wine-faced sea, and Virgil's use of the metaphor of the marble smoothness of the sea as Aeneas approaches the Tiber in Book 7 of the Aeneid, especially with its Etnian echo from fragment 384, may well have encouraged an architectural rendition of the conceit on the Pantheon's floor. Oceanus was the god whose waters encircled the world, and from which all rivers issued, and the sun rose from and set into his waters. Homer had rimmed the shield of Achilles with Oceanus, as would Hesiod the shield of Hercules. And in the Aeneid, Virgil would have Jupiter recount Rome's prophetic destiny to be achieved by Augustus in these terms, quote, "From this noble stock there will be born a Trojan Caesar, to bound his empire by Oceanus at the limits of the world, and his fame by the stars." The association of Oceanus with Hercules would have had particular importance to Hadrian. In his study of the Bocca della Verità, Barry explores how Hadrian saw himself as a new Hercules, pairing his portrait with that of Hercules on a series of coins. Trajan, too, he points out, had fashioned himself as a Hercules. Quote, "But just one emperor, Hadrian, minted coins combining both Hercules and Ocean, and then an aureus, the coin of the highest denomination in this era, of almost pure gold, in no fewer than 5 versions." As Brian Bosworth has explained, Alexander the Great's conquests that extended to the edge of the world were celebrated as having equaled the merits of Hercules, the traditional benefactor of humanity who traversed the world and purged it of criminals and monsters. Accordingly, Barry argues for Hadrian's self-association with Hercules and Oceanus as a reference to ruling over the oikoumene, a message enhanced by monuments at the edge of the Roman Empire in Britain, including a mask of Oceanus similar to the Bocca della Verità. Hence, this symbolic feature in Britain, at the far limit of the world, accords well with the symbolic reading of the floor that I am proposing inside the rotunda of Hadrian's Pantheon. And at Hadrian's villa at Tivoli, at least one, and possibly 2 marine friezes with the exotic animals from the fringes of the empire included figures of Oceanus. As the emperor walks through the Pantheon, he sets the floor into motion. As Mark Wilson-Jones has demonstrated, there is a dynamic quality to the overall surface pattern, such that when viewed along the main axis, it presents a pattern of squares that then shifts into diamonds when seen on the diagonal axis. Yet this dynamism goes even further. At the far edges of the Pantheon's floor, there are partial squares and partial diamonds that appear to slide under the bounding wall of the rotunda, a visual metaphor of empire that extends beyond the confines of the building to encompass the entire world. This is a remarkable visualization through an unprecedented type of architecture of Virgil's proclamation about Rome's prophetic destiny of achieving empire without end, with no bounds in space. And just as the panels that personify the totality of Rome's restored provinces around the outer perimeter of the porch have a corresponding Hadrianic coin series celebrating his restoration of provinces and cities, so too does the theme inside the Pantheon's rotunda of Rome's rule over the world, as having been consolidated by Hadrian, have its corresponding coin issue of the restoration of the world, which Jocelyn Toynbee dates to 119 to 121 CE, that is, to the early years during the construction of the Pantheon. Since this is arguably the Pantheon's most important message conveyed by the meeting of the solar shaft and the floor, one should not be surprised to discover retrospectively that the same configuration has been presented in an abbreviated manner in the entrance bay, shown on the right. Here, at the entrance bay, on a field of Vanozzetto, a yellow square with central red porphyry disc occupies the middle position, with partial red-banded squares open to the east and west, which disappear at the side walls, sliding under and outward in a way comparable to the partial squares and partial diamonds that meet the walls of the interior of the rotunda. The central disc, positioned directly under the oculus, the controlling location of the entire building, is unique. It is the only instance in the Pantheon of Egyptian porfido biggio, of the type now called granito biggio verdagnolo, subtype either pedicolare or pedictoso. Gabriele Borghini in Marmi Antichi of 2021 terms it extremely rare for Rome. This stone presents a red-gray granular texture whose color evokes both the purple and red porphyries used in the Pantheon. And in this case, it is fashioned with book-matched images of mirrored red arcs that evoke the solid red porphyry discs in this and other alignments, as well as the directional red porphyry bars discussed above. This photo was taken with a view with one's back to the entrance and with one's gaze toward the main apse. There is a sense of movement in these mirrored red arcs, echoing the coursing of the sun, but now signified not by the yellow stone of the sun, but rather by the stone of the emperor. At the Pantheon, the dynamism of the image of an expanding empire without end on the floor is complemented by an analogous image in the dome. As William MacDonald and William Lurkey have explained, the dome's asymmetrical coffers, with their perspectively telescoping layers and their innermost panel pushed upward toward the top of the frame, impart the impression of space actively receding upwards and outwards, away from the grid of ribs and meridians that frames the closest surface of the dome. But this effect is enhanced by the angling of the frames and the coffers, such that the lower portions remain in light and the upper reaches disappear in shadow. Furthermore, not only is the dome dynamically expanding, but it also does not sit statically upon its base. Rather, it appears to hover in air. As J.B. Ward Perkins has stressed, the different rhythms of the vertical features of the attic band and the dome above, whereby the ribs of the dome do not align with the pilasters of the attic, quote, undoubtedly emphasize the visual discontinuity, thus contributing to the magical soaring quality of the dome. In addition, the architect has boldly created a discrepancy between the diminutive pilasters of the attic and the weighty dome that it carries. As William Lurkey explains, and I quote, instead of a serious statement of weight and support at this critical juncture, the architect goes out of his way to emphasize that his attic cannot support the dome. The effect of the original attic before its partial and approximate restoration in the 1930s, shown here, would have been even more effective because, as Lurkey further emphasizes, the porphyry pilaster shafts originally were flush with a marble surface, with only their white marble bases and white marble capitals projecting outward in relief. And finally, the Heinz Keller. It was the, quote, smooth, flat, and graceful effect of this attic that makes the dome, quote, appear to hover in air. Just as the emperor was symbolically given a controlling role in the narrative on the Pantheon's floor through the symbolism of the red porphyry discs and the red directional porphyry lines, so too is this narrative reinforced at the attic, where the pilasters are made of imperial purple porphyry. And whereas the initial understanding of the hovering dome comes from the faculty of perception, there may also have been an intellectual component to its message. Christian Just-Gaugier, while focusing on Hadrian's interest in Pythagorean thought, has argued that Hadrian's Pantheon displays the numerological characteristics of a Pythagorean construction. The idea is intriguing, but does not need to be tied specifically to Hadrian's intellectual predilections. There appears to have been a long-standing tradition in Greek architecture whereby architects used Pythagorean numbers, ratios, and proportions, as well as relevant geometric configurations, to invest a building with a cosmic harmony shared by the ratios of music, which inform both earthly music and the musical harmonies of the heavenly bodies. And it should be remembered that for Varro, the number 7 for the Septimontium, which at Hadrian's Pantheon organizes the corpus and ribs of the dome, was a Pythagorean number with mystico-religious resonances that included the number of zones of the sky. With regard to the visual illusion of the Pantheon's hovering dome, it may be significant that the seeming pilasters, which ring the attic zone just under the dome, and which could not possibly support its weight, number 64, what Jules Gaugier terms the great unifying number in Pythagorean thought. We can now understand how this diminutive attic zone was able to support the massive dome through a cosmic numerology without need of a structure that obeyed the earthbound laws of physics. The prime mover, so to speak, of this attic zone is the emperor, represented by the purple porphyry pilasters. Situated in the middle of the rotunda's elevation, between the expanding floor and the expanding dome, the emperor serves as guarantor of the peace, the order, and the prosperity of the empire, as represented by this highly symbolic architecture. Here, then, was Rome's second symbolic representation of its central position in the universe. It had received its first such symbolic sign under Augustus, when the princeps had erected in the Roman Forum in 20 BCE the Golden Milestone, which listed the distance to Rome's major cities across the reaches of the empire. Augustus located this Golden Milestone to the opposite side of the imperial rostra as a pendant to the mundus, the shallow circular hollow dug by Romulus as the first ritual act of founding the city of Rome, where it served as a symbolic center around which the land of the city was then ritually plowed. Through the coupling of these two symbolic forms, the mundus and the golden milestone, observes Nicole Belache, quote, "For the first time, Rome's political and historical center coincided topographically to signal the center of the world." Hadrian's Pantheon reiterated the message on a scale and through a dynamism that corresponds to what James Porter has termed the ancient Greek and Roman interest in the sublime. Whereas we have considered the most significant intersections of the coursing sun with the architecture of the Pantheon, according to the solar calendar and according to Rome's foundation day, there is still one more important solar encounter to address. Marina de Franceschini and Giuseppe Veneziano have discovered that at noon during the two periods of April 6th to 8th and September 4th to 6th, the shaft of sunlight passing onto the porch through the doorway creates what they term a light square that lands on the disk of gray granite within the intermediate block closest to the entrance, creating an apparition of the typical unit of the floor pattern of a circle within a square found throughout the interior of the building. And the active nature of the light, which superimposes a luminous square over the permanent disk on the pavement just in front of the threshold to the domed rotunda, imparts the impression of a Pythagorean solution to the problem of the squaring of the circle. Once again, the sun god helps to design the architecture and to give it meaning. And inside at the same moment, the sun outlines the shape of the entrance vault, which I also illustrate with their photo, in which they call, after Rufinus of Aquileia, a kiss of the sun. The most intense encounter with the sun takes place inside the rotunda at noon on the summer solstice. In part, this is a function of the time of the year, when the sun is at its hottest. In part, this is a function of the position of the shaft of sunlight within a large interior space, offering a dual experience at the same time of the shaft of light surrounding the body and of the shadows that fill the immense rotunda beyond the shaft of light. And in part, this is a function of the form of the architectural container, which intensifies all of these effects. Vitruvius's description of the ideal shape for a sauna was similar to that of the Pantheon's rotunda. Quote, "These rooms ought to be constructed on a circular design, so that the force of flame and vapor can escape along the curvatures of the walls and out the center at an even rate. And however broad they are, they should have the same height up to the spring of the dome and should have an oculus at the center." Considered in the opposite manner, such a volumetric shape best concentrates the heat, as can be seen from the scaled models of 19th century kilns for firing porcelain on display at the Sèvres National Ceramics Museum in Limoges, all miniaturized approximate versions of the Vitruvian sauna. As Giangiacomo Martinez has noted, the Vitruvian sauna has the height of 1.5 times the width, whereas the Pantheon's dome presents a more concentrated volume of 1:1. Hence, the feeling of heat when standing within the intense shaft of sunlight at noon on the summer solstice. And now for my last section. The type of physical encounter through the body encountered here at noon on the summer solstice corresponds to what 19th century Einfühlung philosophers would term Körpergefühl, literally a feeling within your body. The experience is overwhelming, truly awe-inspiring, as the heat from this concentrated shaft of sunlight feels as if it is infusing every pore of your body, while the brilliance of the light itself makes the space beyond it nearly disappear in a disorienting darkness. The experience is tantamount to what Rudolf Otto would define as the experience of the holy through the feeling of primal numinous awe. It seems that this light-filled epiphany might have been analogous to that experienced at the sanctuary of Demeter at Eleusis, where Augustus and Hadrian each was initiated into the mysteries. Let us consider several passages from Plutarch, published in Kevin Clinton's Epiphany in the Eleusinian Mysteries, 2001. In On the Soul, Plutarch describes the culminating part of the ceremony, quote, "But then one encounters an extraordinary light." Similarly, On Progress in Virtue, he recounts that, quote, "When the temple is opened, the participant, beholding a great light, adopts a different attitude, silence and awe." Plutarch seems to be suggesting some manner of full bodily engagement, which he likens to the encounter with an extraordinary light at the moment of dying. In fact, the paragraph begins, "Then, at the point of death, the soul suffers something like that, what those who participate in the great initiations suffer." A physical representation of this experience can be found elsewhere in Rome, in Caravaggio's Conversion of St. Paul on the way to Damascus in the Terracci Chapel at Santa Maria del Popolo, where the painting evokes the experience of enveloping and blinding light that throws the surroundings at noon into darkness, precisely as in the neighboring Pantheon. In fact, Paul's narrative in Acts 22.6 places the vision at the time of noon. "As I made my journey and drew near Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone about me." Whereas in the New Testament account, Saul, now Paul, is temporarily blinded at the time, Caravaggio's painting captures the duality of the experience of ecstatic epiphany in the Pantheon that combines an enveloping light and a circumambient darkness. The spiritual power of this experience is reflected in the spontaneous gesture of tourists today, who, after stepping into the shaft of light, immediately raise their hands in the primitive gesture of worship of an orans. To conclude, I would like to leave you with 4 thoughts to consider. First, the Pantheon is an experiential building. To understand it fully requires a visitor to step into the shaft of divine solar night at noon in a progressive sequence of ever-intensifying illumination and heat, starting with the equinox on the porch, proceeding into the entrance bay on Rome's birthday, and culminating with the embrace of the sun inside the rotunda on the summer solstice. We must ask ourselves what these experiences would have meant to Hadrian, who, as Penelope Davies has reminded us, identified with the sun. Second, the Pantheon is a narrative building. repeatedly telling the tale of Rome's prophetic destiny to rule over the world under the guidance of the emperor who is sustained by the sun god. The way that the colored stones are used with a simple, easy to understand symbolism to convey that narrative is most likely unprecedented and certainly remarkable. Third, the Pantheon belongs to the realm of the sublime. Its vast interior space, seconded by the sun god's active participation in the building's narrative, which also takes place on the porch, all further sustained inside by the illusionism of the endlessly expanding floor and the hovering and receding dome. And fourth, we could now return to the controversy about who was the patron of the Pantheon. Both Trajan and Hadrian were consummate warriors. Yet, as Indra-Cagus McEwen has reminded us, it was Hadrian who arguably was schooled in rhetoric, possibly by the great Quintilian. It was Hadrian who wrote and delivered speeches for Trajan. It was Hadrian who was the amateur architect. And as Pierre Gros stresses, it was Hadrian who was said to be an expert in astronomy. And so we have to ask ourselves, which of Rome's emperors, Trajan or Hadrian, was more likely to sponsor an architecture that translates into visual form at the level of the sublime, the most famous line in Latin poetry that foretells an empire with no bounds in time or space? Thank you.